We now prove the product rule for derivatives. It goes like this. The product of two differentiable functions f and g is itself differentiable. And furthermore, the derivative of that product of f and g is equal to the first function times the derivative of the second plus the second function times the derivative of the first function. So how are we going to prove this? Well, we'll go back to the definition of derivative. The derivative of f of x times g of x is, by definition, the limit as delta x goes to 0, f of x plus delta x times g of x plus delta x minus f of x times g of x, all divided by delta x. Now, to continue the proof, we have to do a little trick. We're going to add and subtract the same quantity in the numerator. And you'll see why in a moment. It'll permit us to sort of simplify the work. So we're going to add and subtract minus f of x plus delta x times g of x, and then add it here, f of x plus delta x times g of x. So we're subtracting it and then adding it, so we aren't changing the numerator. Okay, but given this sort of amplification of the numerator, we can now split it into two pieces. Factor out f of x plus delta x, and you're left with g of x plus delta x minus g of x over delta x. And now also factor out g of x, and you're left with f of x plus delta x minus f of x over delta x. So we have that limit of a sum, which is the sum of the limits. The same expressions, but now we're adding up two limits. This first expression is really the limit of a product, isn't it? So it's the limit of the first times the limit of the second. And the same with this second term, it's the limit of the first times the limit of the second. Well, let's analyze these limits. What happens as delta x goes to 0 of f of x plus delta x? That's just f of x. What's this expression? That's the derivative of g prime of x. How about the limit of g of x as delta x goes to 0? Well, that's just g of x. And finally, this is nothing more than f prime of x. So what have we shown? The derivative of the product is the first function times the derivative of the second plus the second function times the derivative of the first.